Have you ever wondered how the Bible, the most influential book in history, was actually formed? We believe it was simply inspired by God. But what if there was more to the story? What if human hands, driven by political interests, religious disputes, and even control strategies, had shaped the text we know today? Why were some texts exalted and others deliberately hidden or even destroyed? Over the centuries, decisions made in closed rooms by leaders with obscure agendas defined what was sacred and what was forbidden. Mysterious books such as Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Apocryphal Gospels contain fragments of truths that have been suppressed. Was the formation of the Bible really an act of God or an elaborate power play? In this video, we uncovered the dark secret behind the formation of the Bible, exploring the reasons behind exclusions, the political influences of ancient empires, and the manipulations that still resonate in modern faith. Prepare to challenge everything you thought you knew as we descend through a labyrinth of mysteries, power, and spirituality. Imagine the year 325 AD, where a Roman Empire frayed by cultural and religious divisions is about to be unified by a single strategic coup. Constantine, the emperor, was not a man known for his fervent piety, but for his unbridled ambition. The Council of Nicaea, which he called, was not just a theological meeting. It was a carefully orchestrated political spectacle. Historians suggest that he sought a stable throne rather than divine truth, and this is reflected in the decisions that altered the course of Christendom. After all, who can you trust? Faith or the power of a crown? It is said that Constantine, baptized at that point only on his deathbed, used his influence to eliminate internal disputes between bishops. But the truth seems much darker. He knew that an empire unified by religion would be much easier to govern. The Arian controversy, which debated the divine nature of Christ, became the ideal stage for manipulation. Behind the council's doors, voices were silenced, texts were ignored, and decisions, well, perhaps more political than spiritual, were made. Who gained from this? Certainly not ordinary Christians. The records of Eusebius of Caesarea show us a curious scenario. While bishops discussed dogma, Constantine watched like an invisible conductor, guiding the notes of a symphony that suited him. Texts considered dangerous because they challenged the centralization of authority began to disappear. Was it a coincidence that the censored books defended a more individualized and, therefore, less controllable spiritual knowledge? The Bible, as we know it, was beginning to take shape, but not without costs for those who dared to question it. Perhaps most intriguing is the unspoken question: why have so many alternative texts and heretical gospels been ignored? The emerging church, allied with imperial power, needed a linear narrative, something that justified its authority. More complex or esoteric doctrines were a nuisance. After all, how to govern masses who believe that the kingdom of God resides within them and not in institutions? It is no wonder that the council preferred silence on such ideas. And so, the Council of Nicaea not only defined dogma, but began an era of persecution of knowledge that threatened the status quo. It was the beginning of a long journey, where spirituality and politics intertwined in uncomfortable ways. But was this explosive mix enough to silence all dissenting voices? Or are we just beginning to unravel the echoes of this moment? Imagine an arid desert in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, where, in 1945, farmers stumbled upon clay jars filled with ancient manuscripts. They were the Apocryphal Gospels, texts that had been deliberately hidden from history. The Gospel of Thomas, one of these finds, is one of the most intriguing. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it does not narrate miracles or stories from the life of Jesus. Instead, it presents 114 sayings attributed to Christ, many challenging official narratives. Who wouldn't be curious about a phrase like, "The kingdom of God is within you"? While the early church was structuring its foundations, texts such as the Gospel of Jude and Thomas were seen as dangerous. Judas, for example, is portrayed not as the traitor, but as the closest disciple, chosen for a divine mission. This version, almost a paradox for traditional doctrine, bothered religious leaders. Accepting such perspectives would mean dismantling the narrative of guilt and redemption through institutional mediation. After all, a redeemed Judas was also a church without a monopoly on salvation. But why were these texts deleted? The 4th century was a period where Christianity struggled to consolidate itself, not just as a faith, but as an institution of power. The apocryphal Gospels, with their tone of gnosis and inner search, offered a type of spirituality that escaped hierarchical control. If each individual could find God in themselves, what would be the role of the church? Texts like these were labeled heretical and, in many cases, destroyed. But some have survived as uncomfortable reminders of an alternative truth. Biblical archaeology has brought these narratives to light and, with them, the possibility of a reinterpretation of Christian history. Isn't it fascinating to think that there are two versions of Christ? One institutional, shaped by the church, and another more enigmatic, which defies convention. It is as if we are faced with an incomplete puzzle, where crucial pieces have been deliberately hidden or discarded. The question that remains is, who decides what is sacred? And perhaps the most provocative thing is to reflect on how the narrative could have been different if these texts had been preserved. What did Jesus really teach? Would he be more mystic than master? The apocryphal Gospels force us to reevaluate what we know and, more importantly, to question what we have been told. But if this is just the beginning of the story, what else awaits us in the texts that remain buried, hidden, or ignored? Imagine a pre-flood world where the heavens and earth were more connected than we could ever imagine. It is in this scenario that the Book of Enoch transports us, narrating stories of fallen angels, known as Watchers, who descended to earth to teach humanity forbidden secrets, astrology, metallurgy, war art, knowledge that transformed society, but at a terrible cost. Enoch, the chosen scribe, recorded everything. But what made this text so dangerous that it was excluded from the biblical canon? Could it be the fear of an overly empowered humanity? The Council of Laodicea, in the 4th century, decided that the Book of Enoch had no place in the official narrative, perhaps for good reason. Its description of rebellious celestial beings offered an alternative explanation for the human fall, disconnected from the classic story of Adam and Eve. The text exposed a web of forbiddance, knowledge that could easily destabilize the foundations of a centralized faith. After all, who would control human spirituality if the source of knowledge was heavenly and not earthly? Interestingly, the Book of Jude in the New Testament directly quotes the Book of Enoch, Jude 1:14-15, recognizing its importance among the first Christians. So why eliminate it? The answer seems clear: doctrinal control. The church could not risk ideas like Enoch's, which exalt the search for the unknown and the questioning of dogmas, becoming popular. Instead, a narrative was promoted that centralized power and interpretation in the hands of a few. The Book of Enoch also offers a window into another fascinating question: its connection to lost civilizations. Some passages seem to echo knowledge present in Sumerian and Egyptian mythology, suggesting a cultural exchange that defies traditional chronologies. Could the Watchers be the same ancient gods that civilizations worshipped? Or were they the bearers of censored knowledge, which we now only glimpse through fragments and ruins? When delving into Enoch's lines, it is impossible not to wonder, what else has been hidden from us? If this text, which has survived for millennia in parallel traditions, contains such secrets, what about other even older documents? Enoch's exclusion was just the beginning of a long battle against forbidden knowledge. But was that enough to erase their marks? Or do the truths he carries continue to echo between the lines of history? Imagine a young Bedouin shepherd casting stones in search of a lost goat in the caves of Qumran, when he hears the sound of breaking pottery. Thus began one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Inside those jars were documents that not only echoed traditional scriptures, but also contradicted them. Unknown psalms, different interpretations, and excluded texts revealed a Bible much more diverse than the version consolidated by the church. What else could be hidden in these caves? Among the texts found, Psalm 151 draws attention. It celebrates David's victory over Goliath, but its exclusion from the Western Bible raises the question: why keep certain texts and discard others? The Dead Sea Scrolls show that the modern version of the Bible has been extensively edited over time. It wouldn't be fair to ask, who had the power to decide what would be read and what would be forgotten? After all, censored knowledge always carries a greater reason. The essence, the community that likely produced the manuscripts, lived in isolation, guarding spiritual secrets that challenged Jewish orthodoxy at the time. His texts reveal a universe of mystical ideas, from apocalyptic interpretations to advanced spiritual practices. It is as if they had encoded on parchment a spirituality that did not bend to religious conventions. Would they have been persecuted precisely for this independence of thought? The discovery of these manuscripts also reopened debates about the process of compiling the Bible. Why have some parts of these texts not yet been fully disclosed? Some fragments remain locked in safes, kept as relics, and researchers face barriers to studying them. Are these secrets kept to protect religious traditions, or to hide something that could challenge dominant narratives about faith and history? In the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls leave us with a disturbing question. What if what we think we know about the modern Bible is just the tip of an iceberg? Each fragment found in the caves is a piece of a puzzle that we may never see complete. But if the answers are hidden, what exactly are they trying to protect from us? Imagine yourself in the 16th century, a period of religious turbulence where the Protestant Reformation challenged the hegemony of the Catholic Church. In response, the Council of Trent in 1546 brought together clergy to consolidate the biblical canon, officially declaring which books were inspired by God. But was this selection driven solely by spiritual intentions, or was it a political act to reassert control over the Christian narrative? After all, manipulating which texts would be accepted was, in practice, manipulating the faith of the masses themselves. Among the canonized books are the Deuterocanonical, which reinforce fundamental dogmas of Catholicism, such as purgatory and the intercession of saints. Coincidentally, these were points strongly questioned by Protestant reformers. This strategic choice demonstrated that the Church not only defended its theology, but also consolidated its political power. Books that could suggest more individual interpretations of the faith, on the other hand, were discarded. Wouldn't that be an effective way to silence independent thought? But what happens when an institution has a monopoly on the sacred? Faith stops being a personal quest and becomes an instrument of control. Over the centuries, the Church has exercised absolute authority over texts considered canonical, eliminating alternative interpretations that threatened its hierarchy. Gnostic texts and apocryphal Gospels, with their more introspective spiritual views, were labeled as heretical, falling into obscurity. It is as if the forbidden knowledge had been locked under lock and key. The decision to shape the canon was also a way to ensure that the religious narrative was aligned with the interests of a centralized power. For example, the Council of Trent reaffirmed the 7 sacraments, a structure that depended directly on clerical mediation. Any text that encouraged independent spiritual practices was automatically excluded. After all, how could we sustain a system that centralized salvation if people began to believe that they could find God on their own? And so, canon selection became a tool of control, consolidating the Catholic Church's authority over Western spirituality and culture. But can all truths be hidden forever? Or do these texts, relegated to oblivion, still hold secrets capable of challenging the foundations of institutionalized Christianity? Picture the 4th century, when Christianity had already become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. In this context, Jerome appears, a scholar with a temperamental personality, with the monumental mission of translating the Bible into Latin. The work, known as the Vulgate, was not just a literal translation. It was an ideological intervention. Jerome, aware of the theological disputes of the time, adjusted text to strengthen emerging doctrines. Would it be a work of faith or convenient manipulation? A notable example is the translation of Genesis 3:15. The passage, originally referring to the offspring of the woman, was adapted to suggest that Mary would crush the serpent's head. This adjustment consolidated the basis for Marian theology, essential for the construction of the figure of Mary as mediator. But who benefits from such a change? Wouldn't it be a coincidence that this reinforcement coincided with the growth of veneration of the Virgin in imperial Christianity? The exclusion of texts also marked Geronimo's work. Books such as the Book of Enoch and the Gospel of Thomas were discarded, ignoring their influences among early Christians. By prioritizing narratives that centralized the authority of the Church, Jerome helped shape a Bible that served institutional power. After all, texts that encouraged individual spirituality could weaken the need for a clerical hierarchy. Jerome's influence went beyond the text. His translations standardized interpretations throughout the Roman Empire, eliminating regional versions that could foster theological divergences. But the question that echoes is, to what extent is the Vulgate faithful to the original texts? Jerome took creative liberties that still resonate in modern theology. Isn't it ironic that a so-called popular work, Vulgate, was used to consolidate an elitist view of the faith? And so, the Vulgate Bible became the foundation of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. But if Jerome himself adjusted narratives to suit the interests of his time, what else could have been rewritten? Perhaps each line carries a trace of an older truth, a knowledge that has been adapted, censored, or simply forgotten. But has history been silenced so easily? Imagine a world where the Bible as we know it is just the tip of an immense iceberg, submerged in waters of censorship and oblivion. There are intriguing references in the Bible itself to texts that have never reached us. The Book of the Wars of the Lord, cited in Numbers 21:14, or the Acts of Solomon, mentioned in 1 Kings 11:41, are clear examples. Why were they excluded? Were these books so subversive that it was safer to erase them from history? Or did they contain details that could not be controlled by religious authorities? These missing texts are not mere footnotes. They are missing pieces of a spiritual puzzle. Imagine the Book of the Wars of the Lord, possibly filled with descriptions of conflicts and divine interventions. What would it reveal about the relationship between God and his people? What about the Acts of Solomon, which could expose secrets about his wisdom, wealth, and political alliances? Perhaps the details contained within were too disturbing to be accepted by the mainstream narrative. The process of compiling the Bible was anything but neutral. Texts were chosen or discarded based on political and theological interests. The disappearance of these books does not appear to be an accident, but a deliberate decision to control access to knowledge. It is as if these writings were silenced to ensure that the official version remained intact. But which is more dangerous? The lost truth or the consequences of revealing it? The absence of these books also raises questions about what else may have been left out. What other ancient texts mentioned but never found could have shaped the modern view of spirituality? And most importantly, who decides what is worthy of being preserved or condemned to oblivion? History, in this case, is not only written by the winners, but edited by them. As long as these lost books remain out of our reach, the mystery only grows. It's impossible not to wonder, what could they reveal about the historical and spiritual events that shaped the ancient world? Would they be a key to understanding humanity, or a reminder that excluded knowledge never stops echoing, waiting for the right moment to resurface? Imagine the figure of Mary Magdalene, for centuries shrouded in mystery and controversy. The Church painted her as a repentant sinner, a broken woman restored by the mercy of Christ. But apocryphal texts, such as the Gospel of Mary, reveal a very different image: a spiritual leader, Jesus' favorite disciple, confidant of teachings that not even the apostles understood. Why then has her true story been silenced? Perhaps because the idea of a woman in a position of spiritual authority was simply unacceptable by the patriarchal standards of the time. In the Gospel of Mary, she appears as a guide, interpreting visions and words of Jesus that left the other disciples perplexed. It is said that Peter, indignant, questioned, "Did he really speak these things to a woman and not to us?" This passage exposes the internal conflict within the early church. Accepting Mary as leader would mean redefining the foundations of Christianity. What was at stake was not just theology, but power. And, historically, power and patriarchy went hand in hand. The account at John 20:16-17 is equally revealing. After his resurrection, Jesus first appears to Mary Magdalene, calling her by name and entrusting her with the mission of announcing his resurrection to others. Wouldn't this be a clear sign of his central role? However, its importance was gradually reduced over the centuries, while other male narratives gained prominence. The repentant sinner became the convenient archetype to subjugate her to the cultural context of the time. It is possible that Mary Magdalene represented a direct threat to the emerging male hierarchy in Christianity. Her image, as the apostle who truly understood Christ's teaching, could challenge the established power structure. Demoting her to the role of sinner was an effective way of nullifying her leadership and reinforcing male dominance. But the truths it carried never completely disappeared. They remain in the hidden texts, waiting to be rediscovered. And so, Mary Magdalene stands as a symbol of resistance, a reminder that forgotten stories can one day be retold. If her true voice still echoes in the apocryphal Gospels, what else does she have to teach us about the role of women in spirituality? And more importantly, why does it still bother us so much to think of her as a leader rather than a follower? Imagine the year 380 AD, when the Edict of Thessalonica declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. This decision, far from being purely spiritual, marked one of the biggest political changes in history. Before that, Christianity was persecuted. Now, it has become a tool of state control. Under Theodosius, the faith of martyrs and persecuted communities was transformed into a pillar of imperial domination. What does this say about the true purpose of its institutionalization? This transition was marked by profound changes in Christian practices. Simple rituals, such as baptism in rivers, were adapted for grand liturgies held in imposing basilicas. These temples, inspired by Roman architecture, symbolized the fusion between Christian spirituality and imperial pomp. But the question remains, has the Christian faith been transformed to reflect the glory of God or the authority of Caesar? The answer may depend on who controlled the altars. The expansion of imperial Christianity was accompanied by colonizing practices. People conquered by the Roman Empire not only had their culture subjugated, but also their faith. Many local gods were reinterpreted as demons, and traditional festivals were Christianized to facilitate acceptance of the new religion. This cunning tactic unified the territory under a single spiritual narrative, consolidating Rome's power. But this fusion of beliefs raises questions. To what extent was Christianity shaped by the cultures it sought to replace? Elements of Roman, Egyptian, and Sumerian mythology were absorbed in a subtle way. Images of Christ as the Son of Righteousness echoed the veneration of Mithras and Apollo, while the liturgical calendar aligns with pagan festivities such as the winter solstice. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Rome's official Christianity was more syncretistic than doctrinal purity. But, like any well-constructed narrative, this fusion was essential to maintain political control over the faithful. And so, the Christianity of faith became a Christianity of power. The question that persists is, to what extent did this conversion to imperialism compromise the essence of Christ's message? And most importantly, If religion was used as a tool of colonization in the past, what marks of this transformation are still present in modern spiritual practice? Imagine the first Christians living under constant threat of persecution and longing for divine redemption. In this context, the revelation of John, with its visions of destruction and final victory, became a powerful text. But its inclusion in the biblical canon was a strategic move. Its language, loaded with symbolism and cosmic terror, not only comforted oppressed believers, but also solidified the authority of religious leaders who used these images to instill fear and submission. But is fear the best vehicle for faith? Apocalyptic texts were common in the ancient world, and many circulated among early Christians, including the Apocalypse of Peter, which offered a vision less focused on fear and more on divine justice. However, only the Apocalypse of John was accepted into the canon. The decision seems less spiritual and more political. Its narrative reinforced clerical control, painting a picture of a final judgment that would punish those who questioned divine authority, or, by extension, the authority of the church. The language of Revelation is full of symbolism that can be interpreted in different ways, which makes it an extremely useful tool. Dragons, beasts, and celestial seals have been used over the centuries to justify wars, persecution, and even the silence of dissent. Isn't it curious how a text that should inspire hope can be manipulated to provoke dread? Perhaps the greatest power of Revelation lies in its ambiguity, which allows it to be shaped according to the interests of those who interpret it. The exclusion of other apocalyptic texts, such as the Apocalypse of Peter, also points to narrative control. The revelation of John, with its emphasis on obedience and divine judgment, fit perfectly into a centralized power structure. Meanwhile, alternative views that could offer less terrifying interpretations have been discarded. It is as if the church chose the most useful version to reinforce its authority. But the Apocalypse of John also raises intriguing questions. What if it were not just a symbolic vision, but a coded text? Some researchers believe that its images are rooted in historical events and ancient esoteric traditions. If so, what else could be hidden between its lines? Perhaps it is not just a tool of fear, but an invitation to seek what is beyond the obvious. Imagine opening the Bible and finding two completely different versions of the same event. This is exactly what happens when we analyze the canonical Gospels. From the conflicting genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, to the discrepancies in the resurrection narrative, the texts are full of apparent contradictions. But were these differences signs of a fragmented truth, or reflections of an addition that forced divergent traditions to coexist? After all, such different stories could hardly have emerged by chance. Genealogies are a fascinating example. Matthew traces Jesus' lineage to Abraham, while Luke connects it to Adam. The differences don't stop there. The names of the ancestors are completely different. This raises uncomfortable questions. Why were two such disparate versions maintained? Some theologians suggest that each author had specific goals in writing for different audiences, while others see it as an attempt to reconcile conflicting local traditions. But what if these contradictions are remnants of narratives that have been censored or adapted over the centuries? The resurrection narratives are also enigmatic. In Matthew, Mary Magdalene meets Jesus after the empty tomb. In Joel, she doesn't even recognize him initially. Marcos, in turn, ends abruptly, leaving the reader with more questions than answers. These variations open space for an uncomfortable reflection. Was the resurrection such a powerful event that it generated multiple interpretations, or are these discrepancies the result of editorial manipulations? The lack of uniformity seems to point to a conscious effort to keep different communities satisfied with their own versions of history. The contradictions go beyond events. At times, Jesus is portrayed as compassionate and forgiving, while at others, he is forceful and even harsh. This duality can be interpreted as the complexity of his figure, but it also reflects the cultural and political influences on the Gospels. Could it be possible that different factions within early Christianity were competing to shape the image of Christ according to their agendas? These contradictions do not weaken the Gospels. They make them more human. Each version is a testimony to the tensions and negotiations that shaped the Bible as we know it. But they also invite us to ask, how many voices were silenced for these narratives to be unified? And more importantly, what truths still remain hidden, waiting to be discovered? Imagine Martin Luther in 1517, nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, challenging the powerful Catholic Church. Luther denounced the sale of indulgences and clerical corruption, but his Protestant Reformation went far beyond that. One of his boldest actions was to revise the biblical canon, removing 7 books from the Old Testament, which he called apocryphal. The question remains, was he purifying the scriptures or molding them to support his theology? After all, the manipulation of sacred texts was never exclusive to the Catholic Church. Luther made changes that went beyond excluding books. In Romans 3:28, he added the word alone to the text, which went on to say, "A man is justified by faith alone." This small change had major theological implications, consolidating the idea that salvation did not depend on works, but exclusively on faith. But doesn't this change raise doubts about the objectivity of the biblical text? Wouldn't Luther, who accused the Catholic Church of manipulation, have done the same, but in the opposite direction? The books excluded by Luther, such as Tobit, Maccabees, and Wisdom, contained themes that did not align with his doctrinal vision. Tobias, for example, emphasizes the importance of good works, while Maccabees celebrates prayers for the dead, a basis for the doctrine of purgatory. These texts represented an obstacle to emerging Protestant theology. Wouldn't eliminating them be a way of shaping the biblical narrative to justify their new doctrine? The Protestant Reformation also introduced the idea that each individual could interpret the Bible for themselves, a radical contrast to the interpretive control exercised by the Catholic Church. But this freedom was more theoretical than practical. Luther and other Protestant leaders quickly established their own interpretations as the standard, resulting in internal divisions and new denominations. Instead of unifying, the Reformation created a kaleidoscope of conflicting views on the same text. And so, the Protestant Reformation, which promised a return to the origins of faith, brought with it new forms of manipulation. Perhaps the question is not who manipulated less, but how each side used the biblical text to reinforce its power and authority. In the end, the question remains, is the Bible a reflection of the divine word or a mirror of human disputes throughout history? And if this knowledge excites you, imagine what else we can discover together. Now click on the video that appears on the screen and subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue this profound journey.